Yes, first of all, I'd like to thank Wicklow Uplands Council and, of course, the West Wicklow Historical Society for the kind invitation. And though I'm delivering the talk today, it is, of course, always teamwork, and we build on the work that others have done before, like Billy O'Brien, like James O'Driscoll, and other colleagues, mostly from UCC, from University College Cork. And James is also involved in our project. Essentially, he did much of the preliminary survey work, and what we're now doing in the excavations is essentially trying to ground truth what that survey work has indicated in terms of microtopographical anomalies, so essentially, platforms, terraces on the hill slopes, which could, of course, be, a number of different things. But I'll come to that in a second. Okay, so as most of you will be aware, and certainly those of you who attended one of the earlier talks by one of the colleagues from UCC, you will know that Brusselstown Ring, or rather the Brusselstown Ring Spinance Hill complex, because the two are joined together almost like Siamese twins, are not, they're not isolated in the landscape, but the Baltinglass Hillfort landscape, or Baltinglass Hillfort cluster, Tom Condit, I believe, back in the 1990s, labeled it Ireland's Hillfort capital, and that title still holds true. So there's still no larger concentration of hillforts in the island of Ireland than the Baltinglass cluster. Although that label in and by itself doesn't really explain a lot. And spoiler alert, I don't have an answer that I can present tonight why there are so many in this particular area. But we're gathering more information and trying to edge towards towards perhaps some answer to that further down the line. We've got Brusselstown Ring here together with Spinance Hill, and let's move on to this is a slightly zoomed in image, and here you can already see indicated that not all of these are coeval. They don't all date to the same period. Hughestown and Rathcorran, and also the enclosure on Spinance Hill 1 are early Neolithic enclosures, so much earlier than the Bronze Age hill forts we have in the landscape. But I should say that those that are labeled here as Bronze Age hill forts, most of them aren't actually dated to the Bronze Age. So we're working on the assumption that they are, because we know, or we think we know, that most hill forts in the island of Ireland date to the late Bronze Age. Between the end of the Middle Bronze Age, then mostly the late Bronze Age, and some of them continue to be occupied into the Iron Age. Again, spoiler alert, Brusselstown Ring is one of them. But you don't usually get new hill forts built in the early Iron Age. So they're mostly a late Bronze Age phenomenon, but some of them have continuity well into the Iron Age, and some of them also see reuse in the early medieval period. So that is the situation here. You can also see that there's loads of other monuments, of course, in the landscape. James O'Driscoll's latest excavation was here. It's a Curses monument on Cadean Mountain, coeval with those early Neolithic enclosures. So part of the explanation why we have that many, or why we find that many hill forts or hilltop enclosures in this landscape is they don't all date to the same period. So not all of them were occupied at the same time, but there's still certainly for the Bronze Age, there's still too many of them in this relatively constrained space for them to have functioned as regional centers at the same moment in time. So it's why we can now tease out the chronology of these monuments a bit. There still is not. The explanation is not that one succeeds the other and the center moves from one hilltop to the next. That doesn't seem to be the case. So that question remains complicated. Just here, so that's not Brusselstown ring, that is just rough Coran here, so an early Neolithic earthwork, essentially causewayed camp. And there's a number of these, at least 3 and potentially another 1 or 2 in the Baltinglass landscape. They are much earlier than what we have at Brusselstown ring, much earlier than the features we've so far been able to date at Brusselstown ring. So they date to between about 4,000, 3,900 and 3,000 BC. So about almost 2 millennia earlier than the Bronze Age monuments. Some of them see a limited amount of reuse in the Bronze Age, but by and large they're a separate category. So here we've got a view of Brusselstown ring here in the foreground and Spinans Hill in the background, seen from the top of Kedin Mountain. So it's a view in this direction here. And you can see that Spinans Hill 1 also, the enclosure has been dated to the Neolithic by the colleagues from Cork. There's a number of cairns, some of them now hidden in the forested part of the mountain, which have not been excavated and are thus undated, but cairns of that size usually also date to the Neolithic. We do not have any cairns on Brusselstown itself, but I'll come back to that a bit further down the line. So here you've got a view of Brusselstown ring, seen from the summit of Spinans Hill, with Kedin in the background, so exactly the opposite direction. For those of you who weren't on the walk last weekend and who may not have been up to Brusselstown ring before, so what you see here, this dry stone wall is this inner enclosure. The dry stone wall itself, of course, is not of Bronze Age date, but it sits on an earlier stone. Well, let's call it a rampart. It hasn't been demonstrated that these are actually the remains of a rampart, and that is not uncommon. You frequently have townland walls or field walls sitting, following the contour of earlier, the outline of earlier monuments. And then, so that is the inner enclosure here, and then you've got this larger outer enclosure. And then this intersects with the so-called Spinans Hill 2 contour ford, more than 130 hectares in size. So both of these taken together here, they are the largest prehistoric enclosed space in the island of Ireland. So it's pretty substantial. But that's not the main reason for the recent media buzz about Brusselstown. That is more about the number of house footprints, of house foundations that we have on the hill. I'll come to that a bit further down the line. Here you've got photogrammetry with the outline of those two, the inner enclosure and the outer enclosure on Brusselstown ring. Then some of it is hidden in this conifer plantation. And then you've got Spinans Hill here, so this is a much earlier enclosure, about 2,000 years earlier, with a number of cairns which are undated but almost certainly date to the same period as that enclosure. And then you have this outer so-called Spinans Hill 2 enclosure that encloses both Brusselstown ring and Spinans Hill 1. And the enclosing elements on Brusselstown ring and this large outer contour ford, they haven't been dated yet. That is work that remains to be done in the future, but based on the general appearance, one would expect them to be of Bronze Age date, but we might be proven wrong on that if we once we actually start digging. So this is what this outer enclosure looks like. So this is part of the Spines Hill 2 enclosure. You've got a bank, you've got a ditch, you've got a counterscarp. In prehistory, the bank would have been more substantial. Some of the height will have been lost to erosion. This yellow part of the outer enclosure, it's less of an earthen bank. It's a more substantial component of large stones. So that would seem to indicate that this part of this outer enclosure and the Spines Hill 2-1 were not necessarily built at the same time. But again, one would have to put a trench, one would have to excavate where the two abut, where they come together, to see which one's earlier and which one's later. Based on how they sit in the landscape, it would seem that Spines Hill 2, this outer larger contour was attached to a pre-existing outer enclosure at Brusselstown Ring, but that has yet to be ground truth. And here we've got a blow-up, so to speak, of this part here of Brusselstown Ring. These black dots here are microtopographical anomalies, so essentially small terraces, platforms, likely prehistoric house platforms. They all have the characteristics and have more or less the size of what one would expect for prehistoric roundhouses or Bronze Age roundhouses. So it's diameter in meters, and most of them fall in the 6, 7 to 10 meter range, which is what you'd expect of Bronze Age roundhouses. The Neolithic ones tend to be at the smaller end of that scale. And you've also got the position here of the 4 test trenches that we've so far excavated. Test trench 1 here pretty much at the top within the inner enclosure, and then 3 further test trenches here on roundhouse footprints on essentially house platforms of medium size between this inner and outer ring. And I'll talk in some more detail about these in a second. So in total, there are more than 600 anomalies that James O'Driscoll identified in mainly through aerial surveys. So he conducted a photogrammetric survey, so essentially taking loads and loads and loads of photographs from a drone in 2017. And these are then run through computer software that uses them to model a 3D model of the ground surface. And that is a fairly precise method, but it doesn't work very well with vegetation cover. So that was supplemented, and for that reason, this survey was supplemented in 2022 by a LiDAR survey. Essentially, it's not completely dissimilar to photogrammetry, but it doesn't use normal photography. It uses laser beams, and tens of thousands of those that are shot from either a plane or these days also drones on the ground, to the ground surface, and the time they take to be reflected to the emitting device is then measured, and it also creates 3D models of the ground surface, and it has the great advantage that it penetrates vegetation cover, unlike the photographic method. To a large extent, there's also limits to that, but it's much more capable to penetrate vegetation cover than purely photogrammetry. So with these two methods, essentially aerial photography and airborne laser scanning, James was able to identify about 600 platforms that look like they might have accommodated prehistoric houses. And 600, that's a lot. It's the largest number of house platforms in any site in this island and the other island. So even in Britain, there's a close second in Scotland, which might actually have a few more, but that's mostly an early medieval site, so from the first millennium AD. So there's nothing comparable from the BC period anywhere in Britain or Ireland. And the next largest roundhouse agglomeration in the island of Ireland is out in County Clare, Turlock Hill. I know there's also a Turlock Hill in this part of the island, but it's not that Turlock Hill, it's the other Turlock Hill. I'll show you a photograph later on, which has about 250-ish roundhouse footprints. So if all of these are indeed roundhouses, then Brusselstown has about twice as many. And 600 houses, even in modern day Ireland, that's no longer a village, that's a town. If all of them date to the same period, which is another question. But as you can already glimpse from this rather schematic picture, there are a number of overlaps, but the number of overlaps is limited. So the thinking behind presuming that these are, or the majority of those, not necessarily all of them of course, but the majority of those is coeval. The thinking behind that is that if you have a house platform that is unoccupied, you don't normally build a new one, you reuse it. So the number of house platforms should be broadly indicative of the number of prehistoric houses or structures that existed at any point in time. Again, not necessarily all of them, but the vast majority. But of course, one has to determine, or one has to establish, if these are actually prehistoric house platforms or something entirely different. And that's what we set out to do in our excavation. Yeah, here you've got again the position of those 4 initial test trenches. The first 2, so trench 1, trench 2, we excavated in 2024, and trench 3 and trench 4 last year in 2025. And National Monument Service willing, we'll come back to do another couple of test trenches, one in a roundhouse down here and the other one in another structure, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. Well, so far all 4 platforms that we test trenched have produced evidence of prehistoric occupation. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a second. So those are photogrammetric images of those 4 test trenches. There's no scale on these, but they are pretty small. Each of these is 1.5 meters by 1.5 meters. Yeah, this one's not quite, because there's a big rock in one corner, so it's more like 1.5 meters by 140. But by and large, that's the size of the test trenches. They are really just test trenches, and we place them close to the center of these house platforms, so one would not expect to find any outer wall foundations in these, and in fact we didn't, but we encountered remains of prehistoric structures in all of them, and I'll run through these individually now. So this is test trench 1, the one house platform that we test trenched, that we partially excavated within the inner enclosure close to the highest point of Brusselstown ring. And yeah, this is just one section drawing here. I'm not going to bore you with too much detail, but it's pretty standard fare. You've got the topsoil layer, and then you've got black layer with very high organic content, which is what you can see here. Some stones, so this is essentially the topsoil removed, what you've got there. And then a layer here below that, with stone cobbles, and you can already see the first emerging here, and then you get to the interface with the geological subsoil. If we're moving to the next image here, so this is the same trench. These are not photogrammetric images; these are just run-of-the-mill photographs. So this is the as deep as we excavated, and you can see the color has changed, so that very dark layer that sat directly below the topsoil and which had loads and loads of charcoal in it has been removed at this point. It's much more reddish brown, but you have this dark, very charcoal-rich streak running almost diagonally through this test trench. And initially we thought that this was, because it had so much charcoal in it, or essentially consists almost entirely of charcoal, that this were the remains of a burnt beam, and that whatever structure stood there had collapsed in some kind of conflagration, and that is probably indeed what happened. But this is not the remains of a beam. This seems to be a drainage channel or drainage gully in the geological subsoil that was then filled with this very charcoal-rich sediment after whatever burning episode or burning event occurred here. There were a couple of stakeholes. One of this, it's not in this section, it would be in the other section here. So very interesting in terms of at least one burning event, potentially two. I'll show you the radiocarbon dates later on. A cobbled surface, so like a floor surface, the interior of a house, with what may have been some kind of drainage channel. And that's really more or less all we can say about this. Finds from all four test trenches, very, very little. There are some bits of burnt clay from this, but that's it. So Bronze Age houses in the island of Ireland, particularly in upland locations, don't normally produce a lot of artifacts, a lot of archaeological objects, entirely unlike what we have in southern Britain, in France, or on the near continent. So there's not a lot of artifactual evidence to go by, but plenty of charcoal, which allows us to date what we've excavated. So this is test trench 2. Again, you've got a layer of stones here, and you can see a cluster of rather larger stones in this corner, which turned out to be the infill of a pit that had been dug into. And you can see it here. So you've got, again, the topsoil, then you've got this layer here that essentially covers the pit infill. Then this large stone is, it would be the one it's not this one, it's the one sitting behind it. And then you've got, this pit feature here that had an infill with 2 separate layers. And you can see this much better in the following slide. So when we've taken out the cobbled surface, and what you can see here, that is the negative of the pit, where we have the pit infill removed. You also have this post hole or stake hole with 2 wedge stones. You've also got 3 stones presumably used for wedging in a stake or a small post there, although there's no hole. It must have been a shallower hole than in this case. So we've essentially only got the wedge stones left. We've got Bronze Age dates from the occupation layer this, from the primary occupation layer, and then early Iron Age dates from the pit infill. So that seems to be indicative of some later activity at the site of Test Trench 2. So at least 2 different episodes of use here. Then we're coming to Test Trench 3. If you remember the earlier slide with the photogrammetry map, that's only 30-40 meters from Test Trench 2, also on the eastern slope. And again, you can see lots of stones. Again, what we would interpret as kind of cobbled surface. And once you've removed that stone layer, again you're onto this reddish brownish subsoil. But you can see that here in the corner it's darkish grey, and you've got loads of stake holes. We've already removed the infills from those stake holes here that kind of surround this corner, or this darker material in the corner in almost a quarter circle. One would have liked to expand the trench, but we just in this test intervention didn't have the time to do so. And again, this has produced both late Bronze Age and some early Iron Age dates. One of the stake holes here, you won't be able to see that in this photograph. This one here that sits very close to the section, it's actually the impression of 3 stakes, not 1. So that stake was renewed, or was swapped at least twice, on top of the original stake position. This area is much darker and much grayer because it has much more charcoal in it. It's probably a hearth feature, so there's a fireplace or hearth in this area, of which we've only captured about a quarter or so. And that's also close to the center of this house platform, so that would make sense. And these stakes would likely have supported some kind of structure to hang a cooking vessel over that house, or hang things to dry. Obviously, we can't be certain of that, but clearly, here we've got clear indication of a domestic habitation, domestic occupation with a hearth feature and stake holes surrounding that hearth. Then we come to yes, and this is just you'd have to flip this 90 degrees. So this is a drawing, not of the entire trench, just of this 1 square meter here, with the indication of the various stake holes. And this one here, it's actually 3, and it's very unlikely that they would have that you would have 3 stakes at the same time. Also, they have given slightly different radiocarbon dates, but that of course can be a consequence of them using wooden poles of different age rather than being indicative of reuse within with a difference of half a century between them. So yes, part of a hearth feature here. The rest of that hearth remains to be excavated, but very interesting. Trench 3 is also I haven't got any photographs here of artifacts. There is an unworked rock crystal from that trench, and part of was it Trench 2? The only other artifact that is distinctly worked from any of the test trenches is a small piece of flint, and that's it. Other than that, we haven't got any artifactual evidence. Now, moving on to Test Trench 4, and that's on the the western slope of Brusselstown ring. Again, you can see here's a pit feature. That's the darker bit here with the larger stones in that corner. Here we've already excavated onto the geological subsoil. Excavation of test trench 4 was a bit more tricky than the other ones, essentially because the rhizomes, or in vernacular, the roots of the bracken that has essentially killed all the grass. So there was no sod, there was no turf layer in this particular location, and we think there was a cobbling or floor layer here, but most of the smaller stones, when you remove the roots, they just come loose and you can't document them in situ. That is why I can't show you a photograph of what that cobbled layer would have looked like. It would have been more roots than stones. So here we are down onto the geological subsoil. Very little charcoal from this trench, but we've got, and we have no late Bronze Age dates in this. We've got 2 early Iron Age dates, and the pit infill has produced a Mesolithic date. So several millennia, not just before the Bronze Age, but even predating the Neolithic. And you can see that this pit here is truncated, so the Iron Age dates are from this top layer. It's a very small piece of charcoal that had produced that Mesolithic date. There is no Mesolithic, artifactual, culturally diagnostic material. So this could mean a number of things. This could be a pit dug in the Mesolithic, nothing to do with this later occupation, or it could be a pit dug in the late Bronze Age or even early Iron Age, and the only bit of charcoal we find is residual material, bit of charcoal that was in the sediment where they dug this pit, and had been sitting there for several millennia. I mean, when we dig there, we also dig up charcoal that's several millennia old. An interesting observation, but one small piece of charcoal doesn't necessarily date that pit. But if it is a pit, if it is coeval with the digging of that pit, that is the earliest feature on Brusselstown Ring, and actually predating any of the monuments in the wider Baltinglass landscape. But one would need to have more evidence to substantiate this. Yes, so let me go back here. So here you've got the corner with these larger stones and that darker, more greyish material, and you would expect there's lots of charcoal in there, but there really wasn't. Then this is further excavated, that corner further excavated. I think we've got another one here where we are, with now got the shadow cast here by the section, but here we're actually down to the bottom of that pit. So shallow pit, and potentially Mesolithic or later, but in any case predating the early Iron Age layer that closes that pit, and it seals the entire stratigraphy. It's not just part of the pit infill. And that is essentially the 4 test trenches. So most of the all of the dated evidence we have is from those 4 relatively small trenches on 4, so less than 1%, less than 0.5% of these 600 house platforms. So statistically that may not be significant, but it is significant that wherever we put a test trench, we found evidence of prehistoric activity and likely prehistoric habitation. So by extrapolation, one would expect that the other 600-ish platforms produce similar evidence. Of course, if we continue to dig in at the same rate, so 2 test trenches per year, it'll only take us about 300 more years to have test trenched all of them. One could, given sufficient means, one could step this up. With 4 archaeologists on the site, working except during winter for say 30 weeks per year, you could have test trenched all of them in 4 or 5 years, but you wouldn't necessarily do that, because you don't want to dig big holes into each and every single feature. You want to leave some evidence for future generations of archaeologists, of course, but one would like to expand the sample a little bit further. But the fact that on each of those microtopographical anomalies that James O'Driscoll identified and that we were ground truthing, that on each of these we did find evidence of prehistoric activity and prehistoric habitation is quite telling. So there is a fair chance that the vast majority of those 600 anomalies are indeed prehistoric house platforms. This is a table of the radiocarbon dates here, and essentially, so radiocarbon date is not just one date, it gives you a date range. So it has a central date and it's plus minus and it has to be calibrated. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but it gives you a range with where these peaks are. There's a high likelihood that the date sits there, and there's also a very small possibility that the actual date falls outside the indicated range, but that's really it's a 3% chance, so it's relatively unlikely. So if we look at the dates here from the first 5 here from Trench 1, they're not all entirely medieval, but this is 1000 BC. This activity here starts around 1000 BC, and then the last date is about 800-ish, between 900 and 800 BC is about 750. So first quarter of the first millennium BC, squarely in the late Bronze Age. Then Trench 2 are those ones. So we've got 3 dates here that are either the very tail end of the late Bronze Age or they sit in the early Iron Age. The problem with dates in this range here is that the carbon-14 content in the Earth's atmosphere is not constant, it changes over time, and the changes between about 750 BC and about 400 BC mean that there is a flat plateau where we can't get, this is a very, very nicely circumscribed, very precise date. In this date range here, it's just physically not possible to get the same level of precision. So this really could sit anywhere between 800-ish and 400 or 500 BC. There's one later date here from Trench 2, from the top layer, directly, not the top soil, but the layer below the top soil, from the early medieval period, which interestingly falls into the 7th century or so, when, of course, Dunbolg, if it is indeed Brusselstown wing, which both James and my colleague Paddy Gleeson from Belfast, who knows much more about the early medieval period than I do, believe it is. And it's interesting that we actually do have a radiocarbon date from that time period when Brusselstown ring was at the center of an interdynastic struggle during the early medieval period. We also have this, much later late medieval date here from Trench 1, from just below the topsoil. So there's some later perturbation here, and charcoal through either root penetration or animal activity can penetrate into deeper levels, and you're not always able to see that in the stratigraphy. Then Trench 3, so the roundhouse here, nice range of dates here from the beginning in the later part of the the 14th century. So that's essentially the tail end of, could be the tail end of the Middle Bronze Age even, but we've also got some Late Bronze Age date from that same house platform. And then when we look at test trench 4, we've got this Mesolithic date, early 5th millennium BC, so when Ireland was still inhabited exclusively by hunter-gatherers before the first farmers established themselves. Small piece of charcoal from that pit infill, but without any artifactual material to go with it, we can't really be certain that this is indicative of human activity. It could have been charcoal from a tree set on fire by a lightning stroke in the Mesolithic period, and that bit of charcoal then ended up millennia later it would not have been exposed at the surface, but if it got buried, then when that pit was dug at some later point in time, it could have just been included as residual material, but there is no later datable material from that pit, so potentially it is Mesolithic. And from the top layer and from the upper part of that infill, we also then have early Iron Age dates in the area of test trench 4. So that's really the only one where we have no late Bronze Age evidence whatsoever. But that's also interesting in that there isn't that much early Iron Age. There isn't that much evidence for early Iron Age activity from Ireland. There's more than we still thought like 20 years ago, considerably more. But it's mostly from multi-period sites that have earlier and sometimes also later occupation. There are very, very few sites that are exclusively early Iron Age, and mostly without significant structural evidence. People in the early Iron Age appear to have been much more mobile and not build, substantial structures. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of, further test trenching on other house platforms. Because if this trend continues, then the early Iron Age occupation at Brusselstown Ring could, from an archaeological perspective, be even more significant than the late Bronze Age occupation. Not because it's necessarily more numerous, but because hilltop settlements in the late Bronze Age are fairly ubiquitous. In the early Iron Age, not so much. Here again, the position of the 4 test trenches, and you can see this other square here marked as C. It is this, I have to take my word for it. This is not circular. This is an oval or boat-shaped structure here on the southwestern slope of Brusselstown Ring. I'll show you another image here. So this is the interior so that photograph is taken from somewhere here. That is the interior of the structure, and you can see these large blocks of stone forming the perimeter. It's fairly large. It's larger than a roundhouse would be. It's not round. So early survey reports from the 1990s do indicate that at that point there was a small stream of water running into it, and boat-shaped structures with water in them are known not from the island of Ireland, not from Britain, but from the near continent in the early Iron Age, and they have late Bronze Age in the Iron Age, not just the early Iron Age, but they have late Bronze Age predecessors used as cisterns, so water storage basins essentially. Now, when we were on site, there was never any water in there, but it is, unlike the house platforms, which are level-ish, but they're not completely level. This one is completely level, as you would, as a basin to contain water would have to be if you want to keep the water in it. So we were on site earlier today doing some more photogrammetry, and if the National Monument Service lets us, we will also put a test wrench through one end of that structure to see if we can confirm that hypothesis that we are dealing with a system here. And if it is, and if it is indeed prehistoric, it could of course be later, it could be early medieval, it could be late medieval, it could be anything. But if it does turn out to be a prehistoric system, that would be very significant because it would indicate the presence of some kind of communal infrastructure that we're not used to think of when we think Irish hill forts. This is something that you would find in southern central France in the late Iron Age. It's a time of just before Caesar's invasion, or also in the Bronze Age then in Mediterranean Spain. But not normally in Ireland. But on the other hand, if we have 600, or even if only half those houses are coeval with that structure, if you have 300 houses there, you need some kind of water supply, and there is a number of small streams that do emerge somewhere on the slopes, but with very, very low output. So if you want to make use of that water, you would have to collect it somewhere. But it would be quite significant. It's not. Again, it's not something that you would expect in an Irish late Bronze Age or early Iron Age context. But it would be indicative of some kind of infrastructure planning in the widest sense, and that would be quite significant because then you're dealing with much more organized settlement layouts. Even if it looks quite chaotic on these maps, there would have had to be some governing principle behind all of this. But that is yet to be confirmed, so we have to see what comes out of that test wrench if we're allowed a big one. So that's the result so far, and you might now wonder, what's all this ruckus about? 4 small 1.5 by 1.5 meter trenches, and is this really all? For the moment that is the hard evidence, but we have to put it into this wider context. So this year, in May, we'll come back to test wrench that system, if we're allowed to do so, and another one of the roundhouses further down the slope here in this area, that one. And then, of course, the question remains: the next step in contextualizing that evidence and in ground truthing those survey findings would be to trench the enclosing elements, Brusselstown ring here, and then also a separate section in Spinans Hill, to determine if those enclosing elements are really coeval with the habitation. They might not be. So a number of years ago, we excavated. Linda and I and some colleagues from Queens, we excavated what everybody thought, also initially surveyed by Tom Condit in the early 1990s, hill fort at Knocknashee in County Sligo, also with an extensive roundhouse occupation, not nearly as extensive as this one, so we're talking like 60, 70, not in the hundreds. And there the enclosing elements turned out to be of medieval or even later date, and some of it was geology. So it wasn't actually a hill fort, it was an unenclosed hilltop settlement. I don't expect that to be the case at Brusselstown Ring, but it remains to be seen. So that would be the next step. The inner enclosure also would have to be dated. It's a bit more complicated because it's really just blocks of stone. There's no remains of any earthen bank. So one would have to be very lucky to find a piece of charcoal just under those blocks of stone. That's not guaranteed. What one could try is optical luminescence dating, which is much less precise than radiocarbon dating or optical luminescence dating. Essentially what it does is it tells you more or less when a surface, and that can be a rock, that can be the ground surface below rock, was last exposed to sunlight. So that involves going up to the hill on a moonless night, taking a sample, and then hoping to get a date out of it. It's much less precise, but it would tell you if those if that enclosing element is Neolithic or late Bronze Age or early medieval. Precision is much less than with radiocarbon, but it would tell you that. But that's it's a fairly expensive thing to do. So for that we would also need to secure additional funding. So we have established that definitely those 4 house platforms, and by extrapolation the vast majority of the remainder, are prehistoric, late Bronze Age, with some indication of early Iron Age reuse. In the case of the house platform where test range 4 is located, exclusively early Iron Age, leaving aside that earlier Mesolithic pit, which may have been there before the whole platform was constructed. We only have the bottom of it, it's truncated. Well, we will hopefully see what's what with that supposed cistern, and then the future steps would involve getting a handle on the dating of the enclosing elements, but that is a larger operation. That's not, you can't do that with 4 people, so you need to bring in a larger team, which costs more money. So that's all a little bit more tenuous. Yes, I did mention those other sites out in the west of Ireland. I did mention Knocknashee. Those 2 other ones are Mollafarna in County Sligo. So we've got this hill with a cairn on top, and then Mollafarna's settlement sits on that plateau. The red circles here. And then you've got Turlock Hill, so the other Turlock Hill in County Clare in the Burren. Completely denuded limestone landscape. This is not the entire site. There is a second summit that's not in this photograph, which has another bunch of roundhouse platforms. Also here, a presumably Neolithic cairn on top. You can see it here in the photograph, and an labyrinthine enclosure here, which is presumably also of Neolithic date. And these 2 also no indication of any defensive structures, enclosing elements. Mollafarna, you might say, okay, the slopes are so steep, you might not need that. But Turlock Hill is a different matter. This landscape here would have looked very different in the Bronze Age. Today, all the soil cover is eroded away. That would have been different back then. But again, whatever enclosing elements were there, might have been there, would not have completely disappeared, and there's absolutely nothing. So not all. What I'm trying to say is that not all roundhouse agglomerations on hilltops are necessarily hill forts. That's how we how we used to think about them, but that's not always the case. And also the excavations at Knocknashee produced very little artifactual evidence, some but not a lot. And Stefan Berg from National University of Ireland in Galway, he came up with this idea that maybe these are not for permanent habitation. These are very exposed. You really don't want to be up there in winter. Not so sure about Brusselstown Ring either, but that these might be more like. I'm using this term very loosely. Pilgrimage sites, or something like that. That are only really frequented, on a seasonal basis. Brusselstown Ring with 600 of those structures, I don't really see that. It looks much more. It's really too substantial for that. But what is interesting here is that those sites are always in immediate proximity to earlier Neolithic monuments. At Brusselstown, we don't have that. But there is, of course, the presumably Neolithic necropolis with the definitively Neolithic enclosure on the adjacent Spinans Hill. So it might be that we have, a similar not layout, but a similar arrangement, just spatially separated out from one another. Whereas here we have the Bronze Age roundhouse occupations on the very same summit as these early Neolithic monuments. So there seems to be these locations aren't chosen arbitrarily. The proximity to earlier Neolithic monuments seems to be a factor in the choice of location, and despite the fact that that Brusselstown ring doesn't have a cairn on it, there's plenty of cairns on the hill next door that is enclosed in the Spinus Hill 2 enclosure together with Brusselstown ring. So defining it as one space. So there are some interesting questions that are emerging from this. What I'm trying to say here is that just dating the houses on Brusselstown ring, and hopefully even if we're able to date the enclosing elements a bit further down the line, that still leaves us with a challenge that we have to make sense of the site, as with any archaeological site, in its wider setting, in its wider landscape, and that's something I haven't addressed really in this talk at all. I focused exclusively on the results from Brusselstown ring, but there is a much wider canvas behind that would also need to be explored. Again, that's what I'm the point here, that this is not isolated. Here you've got the settlement and some Neolithic cairns spatially separated out. What we have been able to establish, so in the 1970s, it was still commonplace to assume that where you have roundhouses next to cairns, that these are the dwellings of the mound builders, that these are Neolithic. We now know that by and large that's not the case. Some of the houses at Mullafarnes seem to be Middle Neolithic, and if any of you ever have been to Sligo town, Knocknaray, Queen Maeve's tomb, there are roundhouses adjacent to that one, and they are Neolithic, but they're also on average much smaller. So this is different, but it's not necessarily coincidental that you have these Neolithic monuments close by. And with that, I thank you for your kind attention.
I'd like to express great gratitude to Wicklow County Council and Deirdre, the Heritage Officer, for supporting us. I'd like to express a deep thank you to Paul and Cora and West Wicklow Historical Society for collaborating with us. The Wicklow Uplands Council is, our values are in partnership and collaboration, and it always brings good reward. And I would most importantly like to thank Dirk and his colleague for making the trip down to Wicklow on a Friday just before the Easter holidays. Appreciate it greatly, and I know you all have a disco to run off to, but there is a bit of tea and coffee if anybody does want to sit around and stay around and have a little bit of a chat, but not for too long because obviously we ran over time. So once again, thanks everybody for the time.